Okay, last week we started on the book of Esther. We went through the first two chapters, and I thought I would just bring up the questions as kind of like a review. There's not going to be a test on this or anything like that. No pop quizzes. The questions are just more for your benefit, and they're always good sometimes for going further into, the lesson. It can spark something that is of benefit. So we're going to look at a few things in the first chapter. Of course, this concerns itself with Esther, and the king's name was Ahasuerus, which means high father. Why did King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, hold a feast and banquet in Shushan, and how many days did it last? Okay, there was about 180 days, and then finally like 7 days of just really getting down to feasting and everything. Okay, so he had this huge feast. This is found in Esther 1, chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. And what did the king request of Queen Vashti, his queen and wife at that time?
He just wanted her to come before him to join him.
Right. Yeah, he requested that she come, and he wanted to show off her beauty. And, okay, how did King Ahasuerus respond to Queen Vashti's refusal? Yeah, that's right. He didn't like it. Kings were sovereign back there. What they said, it went. That was it. And if it was refused or disobeyed, boy, have mercy on whoever refuses him. What question did the king ask his wise men after Vashti refused to come to the feast?
What should we do to her with the law?
Right.
How do we recommend her?
Right. How are we going to handle this? Because we're afraid that if all the princes' wives and so on and so forth, and the wives in the kingdom hear this, that they're going to do the same thing. They're going to refuse requests by their husbands, and then we've got a different problem besides fighting the Greeks. So anyway, that's what took place. We're going to go into chapter 2. And what does history tell us about what happened between chapter 1 and chapter 2? This one I'm a little confused on, so even though it's my question.
Is that when Ezra took the first remnant back?
Yeah, that was going on. That was going on. Deportation, yeah.
That's when the king tried
Right,
to war
right,
with Greece.
right. Okay.
Which is lost.
Yeah.
Okay, what was the plan for finding a new queen?
Let them bring a lot of very young virgins in, and you can check them out and see which one you like.
Yeah. One preacher called it perhaps the first beauty pageant, recorded beauty pageant. How had Mordecai raised Esther, and how is that described? What was the relationship? How were they related? Pardon?
He was her uncle?
Yes. They called him uncle, but in actuality...
He was a cousin.
Cousin, yeah. But they address him as an uncle. You're right. You're both right. And he raised her like his own daughter. So he watched after her. He made sure that she was protected. What did Mordecai tell Esther not to tell anyone?
She was a Jewish.
Right, that she was Jewish. And really, we kind of wonder about that, why that he would encourage her not to say that she was Jewish to the king. But as we go through this lesson, we'll kind of get a hint here as to the reason why. The story may have turned out differently, is the idea. The whole story might have shifted to the dark side of it, so to speak. Okay, what was the end result of the pageant?
Esther won.
Yeah, Esther won. I don't know if she gave a speech, as to what, what her goal or what she wanted. Certainly, she wouldn't have said world peace, because Ahasuerus was just chomping at the bits to take over that part of Macedonia where the Greeks were at. So, okay, and what plot did Mordecai uncover?
Killing the king.
Yes, that there was two conspirators. I can never remember their names, but Bigthan and Teresh were the two chamberlains that had plotted to kill the king, and there were plots against rulers like that in those days. The rulers were always kind of looking back over their shoulder, and they had to be careful as to who that they formed close relationships with politically. If I'm not mistaken, and I'll correct it if I am, eventually Xerxes was assassinated, or he died, and his son, Artaxerxes, I butchered that, but anyway, he took over, and they think that he was very instrumental with instructions and encouragement from Esther in showing mercy to the Jews to go back to build the wall. They had built the temple back under Cyrus, and then there was like 100-year lag there that all this was going on, fighting the Greeks too. And then finally, in the end, they were able to go back and basically rebuild Jerusalem. Okay, we're going to go into then the 3rd chapter of the book of Esther, and we're going to be introduced here to a very despicable, unlikable guy that was very ambitious. In fact, I always kind of said, or always kind of wondered, if he didn't have the throne in mind, and that he was just kind of maneuvering around everything for that eventual purpose. But it's a story of anti-Semitism, and not necessarily the first, but the first instance of where that there was somebody in power who wanted to annihilate all the Jews, just as the saying goes, wipe them off the map. Pharaoh wanted to do the male children in, but he left alone, he was going to leave alone the others, the children and the mothers. But this is the first one. And we're going to find in history, if you kind of chase that through history, you're going to find that there were nations, nation after nation after nation, that tried to kill off the Jews, or they would try to persecute them. I think the most notable in our time and in the lifetime of many was what Adolf Hitler's final solution was going to accomplish. And unfortunately, it met with some disastrous things that happened to these unfortunate people. So in the 3rd chapter, we're going to be introduced to Haman. And during this time, Haman is going to hatch his plot to get rid of the Jews. He's promoted by the king, and the position that he has is that of a prime minister. Now, the prime minister always kind of had the king's ear. If you read about the King of England, most recently Queen Elizabeth, the advisors or the advisement from the prime ministers kind of helped guide the king's decisions. Winston Churchill, most notably, was responsible for helping to guide Elizabeth when she took the throne at the age of 24. And we find that Haman was promoted by the king into this kind of position. Now, his background is rather interesting because he was not a Persian, he was not a Jew. He was an Agagite. I'm not stuttering there. That's just about the way that you could pronounce it and do it justice. He was an Agagite. And the background of that is the Amalekites. If you'll remember, whenever that the children of Israel came up out of Egypt, one of the first people of Canaan, even though that they resolved themselves they were going to go on the king's highway, they weren't going to bother anybody else, the Amalekites were one of the first ones to fight against the children of Israel. And you'll find later on in 1 Samuel chapter 15 an incident where that Saul was commanded, because of what they'd done to Israel. God had commanded through the voice of Samuel, the prophet, for them to wipe out the Amalekites because they would be a thorn, no doubt, in the side of the children of Israel. Well, there were about 200 of them that escaped, if I'm not mistaken on that, in 1 Samuel chapter 15. But Saul took it upon himself, even though that he was told otherwise, to not execute the king. And his name was Agag. I got that right. Well, this, they believe, was a relative of Haman. And so, to give you what happened to Agag, he thought that he was off the hook. And this was the first of Saul's offenses against God, disobedient. And then after that, Samuel took it upon himself and he hewed Agag in pieces. Doesn't explain any more than that. But the result was that he killed Agag as God had commanded them to do. This was Haman's background. And I think that Haman kind of had it in the back of his mind, perhaps, that he was going to kind of get revenge for his people, for the Amalekites. And so we find that because of his position and because the king had promoted him, the king indicated that all were to bow and revere him. He was just promoted. He was just made prime minister. And wherever that he went, they were to treat him like they would the king if it was the king that was there. And so we find that there was everybody who bowed to him except for one. And his name was Mordecai. Mordecai remembered in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 7 through 10 that God commanded the children of Israel not to bow before any god, any image, anything like that. And they were to carry that with them wherever that they went. If you remember Daniel, he and his companions refused to bow before the image of the king at that time, and they were to be thrown into the lion's den. I won't go into all of that, but God preserved them. And God preserves whenever that we're obedient unto him. We don't bargain with God, but God said that he will protect and watch over his people. Whether it was the Jews, whether it was the Christians, whoever that it might be that he's put his favor upon, he said that he would protect them and that he was keeping his watch over them. Now, Mordecai kept this. He would not bow before Haman. I don't know if they'd met each other before. I don't know if Mordecai might have had some sort of animosity maybe buried there, but he wasn't going to bow before anyone other than his God. And so Haman took note of this. And he wasn't real happy about it, as we'll see. Mordecai was kind of a short guy, kind of about my height, 5'10". No, he was a small guy. And so Haman could have just, if he'd just gone on and ignored him, everything would have been fine. But it began to eat at him. And when he found out who Mordecai was, he found out that he was a Jew. And he found out that there was a group of them in the kingdom that believed like Mordecai did. And so he brought this before the king. And he said, "King, there's a group of people here in your kingdom, probably scattered throughout the empire, that they don't obey our laws like we obey them. And their customs are completely different than what our customs are. They observe the Sabbath, or they observe worshiping their God Jehovah on a different day than we observe Marduk." That was the god of the Persians. And you know, if we want to go and we want to buy something on their feast day or upon their Sabbath day, you know, their stores are locked up. We can't buy anything. There were no blue laws, Sunday laws back then. But then they're open all the other time. And they got customs. They observe this Passover thing. What's this Passover that they observe? And some of the feast days. So they're real different. And you know, King, I wonder if they're going to conspire against you. I wonder if they're going to revolt against you. And I see evidence of it because there's this man out here that's been made a judge. His name is Mordecai. And he won't bow to me. And I bet he won't bow to you, King. And so he put it into the mind of Ahasuerus that something ought to be done about these people. We don't want to revolt. We're having enough trouble with Greece as it is. But there was a decree that was instituted at that time that one of the attempts, we could say, of Satan to try to destroy the children of Israel. And so we find that he sent out an edict, and this edict was that on a certain day, these people who are Jews are simultaneously on this day going to be killed. No one is to be spared. Male, female, child, all of them wiped off the face of the earth. And once again, they used their means of communication, which would be the same thing as our Pony Express. They sent the message perhaps by runners, perhaps by horsemen, but it was scattered. If you have the map, you can see that there was quite a big territory there that those messengers had to cover. About 127 provinces were in the kingdom at that time. And to kind of make it more interesting, they were comprised of 127 languages, different languages than what the Persians spoke. So they had scribes that were translating just continually the king's edict into the language of this one over here up in the northeast, this province up here, the province next door to Shushan, all different languages, but they got the job done. So that they were able to communicate that on a certain day, that all of the Jews, their neighbors, might have been Jews. This kind of gives us a glimpse into what it would have been like in Central Europe, Germany, Austria, so on and so forth. The people that had been friends with one another. Yeah, they don't observe Christmas with us, but you know, they're pretty good. Now I'm going to have to kill them, according to the king. And it says down in one place that when they received that edict and when they received that commandment in the 15th verse of the 3rd chapter of the book of Esther, the post went out, that's messengers. They were hastened by the king's commandment and the decree that was given in Shushan, the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Shushan, and probably the rest of the empire, was perplexed. Why are we killing these people? Yeah, they're a little different, but why are we killing them? And so this was the first attempt at trying to annihilate the children of Israel. Well, it didn't go unnoticed, and especially with Mordecai. And in that day and in that time, now we don't see where that he calls upon the name of God. In fact, once again, we're not going to see the name of God evoked or mentioned or referred to, but God was at work. God was taking care of all of this. And we find over in Isaiah chapter 54, and in the very last verse, a portion of it says, "No weapon formed against thee," and Isaiah was speaking on God's behalf to the Jews, "no weapon formed against thee will prosper." And that has been the case down through the years, down through the ages of time. God has protected, some of them, we find 6 million died in concentration camps, but Hitler didn't get done what he intended to do, to annihilate all of them. It was bad what he did to those 6 million, but he did not wipe them off the face of the earth. And so we find that they were perplexed at this, and Mordecai especially. And whenever that Mordecai heard this, and whenever that he received the news, Mordecai didn't go into hiding. In that day and time, whenever that a Jew or anyone in that day and time, any culture, whenever they receive distressing news or someone's died or some great tragedy has happened, they go through what we would call, and I'm not going to do this because Shirley bought this for me, but they rent their clothes. And what that symbolized was that their heart was rent, that their heart was broken. And Mordecai gave great demonstration of this. Not only did he rent his clothes and sat perhaps in sackcloth and ashes out in the middle of the street close to the king's gate, but he began to wail and he began to cry and he began to just, if I would imagine, and I'm taking great liberty with the Word of God, I would imagine that he probably, why, oh God, why is this happening to us? Because it will not only happen to us here in Persia, it's going to happen to those that followed, the brethren followed Zerubbabel, if you will, to build a temple and stayed down there in that region. They're going to get them too. They're going to get all of us if this is brought to pass. And so anyway, we find that this was the case, but yet God was on the scene and God was guiding. God was orchestrating all of this. And so he brought it before Esther. Esther, you're closer to the king than Haman. And you tell the king, maybe he doesn't understand that he's going to kill off an entire race and culture and religion all together. See if you can convince him or turn his heart. Well, we'll find that the Bible tells us that in Proverbs that the king's heart is actually in the hand of God. Any ruler that we see, God is directing his heart. That king, that ruler, that president, whoever it might be, may not acknowledge that he's being led of the Spirit of God, but God is orchestrating the circumstances to get God's will done. And he can use anything. I think about in Numbers, whenever that Balaam was on his way to curse Israel, and the angel of the Lord stood in his pathway with a sword drawn. This is one of those few times where the angel of the Lord made his appearance. And the donkey saw it. And so he just, he'd crash into the wall. He'd fall underneath Balaam. Balaam every time would kill him or try to kill him. And all of a sudden the donkey spoke. And God can use a donkey. God can use anything to speak to us. He can use nature. He can use events that take place. He can use mostly his word. But God can orchestrate anything. And I'm surprised that Balaam didn't go back to Balak and say, wow, we don't need to curse the children of Israel. We need to make some money off this talking donkey. But at any rate, God orchestrates and moves. And as we said, he is the one that is the hand in the glove of history and of providence. And so Esther replied to Mordecai, Mordecai, my cousin, my father, there is the law of the Medes and Persians that no one can go into the king unless they are called for. And I've not been called for about 30 days. I don't know that he's going to. I don't know what's upon his mind that he would. But I do know this, that if somebody goes into him that he grants favor to, and he tips his scepter towards them, then they have an audience with them. And Mordecai makes kind of an interesting statement to her. He said in one place, don't think, in the 13th verse of the 4th chapter, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. So it's eventually going to be found out, Esther, that you are Jewish. And for all, if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, there shall be a deliverance, an enlargement. Somewhere there will be something that will arise and protect God's people. And quotes this, or we quote this, one of the verses of Scripture that is the kind of the foundation for this chapter. Who knoweth but what thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And we can take a lesson from this, that no doubt God was going to use Esther. And sometimes we think, well, God can't use me. God doesn't want to use me. God's going to use somebody else. But how do you know? But what? You're not in this span of time, born in this century, born in this area, with such neighbors as you have. How do you know? But what? God has not brought you to that place in your life for that. And I used to think, to have lived in the days of the kings like David and like the apostles, until I really got to studying what it was like. I'm thankful that I live in the day that I do. But nevertheless, it's still an opportunity for us to do for God as he has placed us. And David said in one place an interesting thing. He was a king. He had slain thousands, 10,000s. But yet, David made this comment, and it's interesting. He said, I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. And you know, I know your hearts. I think I do, but I know your hearts. You all would rather be serving God than the world. Because I want to tell you something today, you are preserving this world. Your presence, your being here, your being a part of this church, you are the salt of the earth. It's preserving this earth. And I can tell you this much, once that this body is taken out of this world and raptured up to be with the Lord, there's no more witness, and no one will have an excuse to say, well, I didn't know about it. But God will say, well, I had Elkton Church right on that highway that wasn't hard to get to, and they preached the gospel. And you preach the gospel. Did you know you're the ones who preach the gospel? Brother Cofer, I thought you did. No, it's you. It's you. You are the example of what God can do in transforming a life. Nevertheless, this was the case with Esther. She was in a dilemma. What should she do? What would you do if you were in that situation? It would be easy just for me just to kind of go off to the side and just maybe ask the king for a trip to the Caspian Sea or Mediterranean to get away from it all. But I think it dawned upon her that if her people will survive, that she's going to have to stand in the gap. And the Bible tells us God will supply the need according to his riches and glory by the Lord Jesus Christ. Esther is somewhat reluctant, but she asked for everybody to fast for her 3 days. And so what Esther does, she goes and she has a big banquet, and she said, let the king and Haman come unto this banquet. Pardon?
She went to the king first.
Oh, she went to the... Yeah, I'm kind of
Skipping.
way off there. Okay. She went to the king first of all, and invited him to come unto this banquet, and invited Haman to come unto this banquet. She goes into the king and she makes her plea before him. She's not been called upon for about 30 days. And she walks in and just kind of stands there until he could see her. And then he tips the scepter towards her, which meant, you come forward. And she touched the top of the scepter. And he asked her this question, what is thy request, Esther? What is it that you come in for me to ask of me? Ask of me, and I'll give you even to the half of the kingdom. That's how much he loved her. She had favor with him. Not because of her looks alone, but because somehow her heart and his heart had become intertwined. And so she made this request of a feast, of a festival of wine, like the one that he had thrown before or had before. And so she said, and let the king and Haman come to this festival or come to this feast. So at any rate, they come. And I've always wondered why that she kind of held off until the next day. And I wonder if maybe she was, not that she was putting it off, but giving herself some time strategically to prepare her heart for what she was about to do. Because it was her life, the life of her cousin, the life of her people that was at stake. And so at any rate, he comes to her festival, he comes to her feast, and then she asked him to come the next day within 24 hours. Haman is there, and he kind of gets the idea. And this is kind of reading between the lines. But Haman might have gotten the idea that the king was going to promote him even more. And he was real rejoicing about it. And he was just, he was just beside himself. Unlike Mordecai, who had been rending his clothes and crying out, here Mordecai was just walking, if you will, on cloud nine. And so he saw Mordecai again. And if he had left it alone, probably would have turned out differently. But he saw Mordecai. And once again, that hatred welled up within him, not just for Mordecai, but also for the Jews themselves. And so he went home and told his wife about it, Zeresh, and told him about how that he had this great feeling, but said, I saw Mordecai, and Mordecai just kind of dulled it. I'm thinking that the king is going to promote me. He's the fly in the ointment, if you will. I just despise him. His wife advised him, said, why don't you build a gallows about 50 cubits high? And on those gallows, you hang Haman. This is probably one of the times whenever that an execution was exaggerated to such a ridiculous extent. But nevertheless, Haman listened to the advice. And we find in the 13th and 14th and 16th verses, 13th and 14th verses of the 5th chapter, said, this is not going to avail. Mordecai, or Haman is speaking here. So long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate, no matter what kind of honor I'm giving, he'll always, always be, if you will, in the way. And I just despise him greatly. Then his wife Zeresh said to all of his friends, and all of his friends that were with him, let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high. I tried to calculate this out. I may have hit it wrong. That would be approximately about 80 feet. About 80 feet. And I think that it was to humiliate Mordecai because he was such a small individual, but for all the people to see what Haman could do. And I think that he was maneuvering towards a power struggle with the king. He was trying to show what he could do. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused a gallows to be made. The king had agreed to the death of the Jews, and now Haman is going to hang or conspire to hang Mordecai. We'll have to tune in next week to see what happens. But at any rate, Haman, we'll look at a few of the questions or just kind of recap what we've gone over. Haman, of course, in chapter 3, he was the prime minister of second only to the king. Haman was bowed down to as he was a great official that was given great notoriety. When he saw Mordecai, he became angry. He found out that Mordecai was Jewish. That began to plant a seed of hatred not only towards Mordecai, but also to all the Jews. So in number 4, he hatched a plan to present to the king how to annihilate and completely wipe off the face of the earth these Jews that are a problem to the kingdom. And the day and the month that it was completed, it was to be completed on the 13th day, I believe, of Adar, which would be the 12th month of the year for the Persians. How did Mordecai respond to the king's edict, the decree? He was upset, wasn't he? He rent his clothes and began to cry immensely. And what was Esther's response to what Mordecai was doing? We didn't go through this, but
She sent him clothes.
yeah, she sent him clothes because he was out there. You know, he was an official, but he was her cousin or her uncle, if you will. And she didn't want to see him like that. But what did Mordecai do? Oh, you gave me a size 42. What did Mordecai do? He turned it away. He said, I'd rather be in this condition than to put on clothes and everybody think that everything is just fine. Okay. And so, how did Esther's decision demonstrate her courage to trust in God?
She says, if I perish, I perish.
Yeah, that's what it came down to. It came down to that. That's pretty hard, isn't it? Whenever that there's a possibility that the outcome is not going to be good. You know, and it takes grace, it takes mercy, but it takes strength to trust God for the final end because it didn't look good for her and her people. How did the king respond to Esther coming in before him? And what questions did he ask her?
What is your request?
Right,
Lovingly, I
He
guess.
they were skeptical, so
Right.
she could come in.
right. She was able to give her request. Okay. She was welcomed into the presence of the king. What if she hadn't been? And we're kind of what if, but what if she hadn't?
He would have had her killed.
Most likely.
I mean,
Yeah.
she came in without being asked.
Right, exactly. And she probably worried a little bit what kind of mood he was in.
30 days, yeah.
Yeah, that's another factor to think about, isn't it? But I believe he loved her in his Persian way. I believe that he loved her, you know, and that he was very fond of her. Okay, whenever that Haman left the banquet, how quickly did his mood change?
As soon as he saw Mordecai.
Right. As soon as he saw Mordecai, here it is. And it just flooded in. He was going to do something. He said, I've got it in the works to kill the Jews, his people. I've got to get rid of this Mordecai. I got to get rid of him now. And he came to a conclusion about how to get rid of Mordecai. Who gave him the idea? His wife, exactly. His wife gave the idea to do what? To hang him. Right. And I believe because it was so high, it was probably a public execution. Probably was going to be the start. Haman was going to make it maybe like a showcase of the start of the annihilation of the Jews. So very good. I appreciate your all's participation and being so patient with me in presenting this. This is a good study in the providence of God, the protection of God, and all of His provisions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did Esther love the king like he loved her? Or was she just knew that she was under his rule and had to obey? And you think,
Personally, I think she did. I really do. What I base that on is that once she kind of saw what his life was like, some of his decisions that were thrown at him. He's fighting a war. If this does not go well, then he's got somebody waiting in the wings to do him in. When a war is lost, there is an idea that this is a weak ruler. We need to change and get another one. And they didn't have elections. You know, they did their kings in when they wanted to change them. So I think that her realizing all of this, this is just personal opinion. I think she did. I think she did love him. And I think in a providential way and in what she was seeing taking place, she may have spared his life at the hands of Haman. Because I would suspect if Haman wanted to kill all the Jews, kill Mordecai, then it was just a matter of time until that he did the king in. And I think she may have sensed that. It is. It's a fascinating account.
Did the Jews live in different provinces throughout that land, or were they mainly in certain places?
I'm going to venture a guess they probably were scattered, and I base that upon the fact that when the edict, whenever that the king agreed, you know, he had to send runners and messengers to all the different provinces and all the different languages. So I'm supposing that being the case, that they were throughout all the provinces. He wasn't going to spare one.
So the king didn't really know anything about the Jews? He just agreed to?
Well, Haman never mentioned the Jews. He
No.
said these people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, he never
Said the Jews, he just
Yeah.
said these people that think different than us.
yeah. And without putting a label on them and what it was other than just the customs and their days of worship. Haman, the king, just, these could be conspirators. We already did 2 in. We've already hung 2. We better make sure there's no more.
About the money they just paid?
The money would have brought him, it was 10,000 talents. Yeah, it was 10,000 talents. But out of it, he was going to get, by their annihilation, $20 million, which went a long ways back then. And that would have financed wonderfully, his military campaigns. Since he couldn't throw another feast to ask for more shekels or whatever, without some sort of problem with his princes. But this was between him and Haman. Interesting. I doubt if the king would have ever eventually got it, knowing Haman. Anyone else?
Oh, whenever they fasted for 3 days, I can't help but believe they were praying. The Bible doesn't say it.
Yeah. I agree. It had to have been, because in that day and time, when you hear of a fast, there was always prayer associated with it. So I think that they were still faithful enough that they went to God while they were fasting. Idolatry got them into this predicament. So I imagine that it was working itself out of them, but nevertheless, they knew what God, they knew by the accounts that they had heard and by the Psalms and so on and so forth what God could do and what He would do for them. They had no choice. Yeah. But anyone else?
I think these scriptures just show us too, though, that we deal in our world today a lot of underhanded stuff and things that have a different meaning than what you would see on the surface and things
Right.
going on, motives. They was then too.
Yeah.
That's any different than what
Yeah.
they are today.
Right.
Yeah. When you look at it and think about it, it's almost like a Shakespeare play.
Yeah.
You know, you got this one over, you know, this doing this and this doing this. And in the meantime, a war over here in the east. But it does show the,
The names and the circumstances and the places and the dates have all changed, but the motives are still there.
yeah, it's human nature. Yeah. That's a good point. Anyone else? It's a good discussion. Okay. There's no further word from anyone. Next week, we'll look at, let's see, chapters 6, 7, and 8. We're going to find out what happens. Does Mordecai get hung? Okay, we'll find out next week. All right. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.
You're dismissed.